Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb and have the enormous privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true 150 years after our founding. This evening, it is a special pleasure to welcome you to a Roosevelt House program on the legacy and enduring significance of the late Mayor of New York, David Dinkins. We are so proud to be celebrating Black History Month with this event devoted to a groundbreaking New Yorker who also happened to be a neighbor and great friend to Hunter College, and whom we had the privilege of honoring several times over the years. It's especially fitting that this program originates at Hunter's Roosevelt House, the one-time home of a leader David Dinkins counted as a hero and an inspiration. Personally, I will always cherish the memories of David Dinkins attending our July summer receptions at Roosevelt House. In his later years, we would bring him a chair and place it right under a portrait of a woman he deeply admired, Eleanor Roosevelt. It was not that David then proceeded to hold court. He was far too modest for that. Instead, everyone in the room gravitated toward him, eager to grasp his hand, tell him how well he looked, or comment on his latest snazzy bow tie. Even if he greeted you only with his legendary all-encompassing "Hiya, buddy," what a warm glow he cast, and how lucky we were to bask in that glow for so long. We miss him. With his appreciation for what he called the gorgeous mosaic of New York, it can be no wonder that Hunter enjoyed such a rich relationship with Mayor Dinkins. For nearly a quarter of a century after he left City Hall, our Upper East Side neighbors shared and symbolized the essential values of education, access, and opportunity for all. The mayor relished the opportunity to speak with Hunter's students and to share with them his wisdom on how to make a difference. In 1993, Hunter presented him with our President's Medal in recognition of his staunch and dedicated support for public higher education and the education and cultural endeavors of Hunter College. And in 2006, it was my great privilege to present him with an honorary degree. That day, he powerfully reminded our graduating students of their responsibility to be what he called the source of our nation's moral wealth. He urged our graduates to devote the rest of their lives to helping others. As Hunter College graduates, he said, "You can do no less." In essence, it was the same message that has guided generations of Hunter students and teachers in the 150 years since our founding, and which he personified throughout his life and career. The words of our historic motto, "Mihi cura futuri," the care of the future is mine. Caring for the future is exactly what David Dinkins did when he finally put his own story into a memoir, A Mayor's Life, Governing New York's Gorgeous Mosaic. Visiting Roosevelt House that year to discuss it, he spoke movingly, as he always did, of the range of human experience in our beloved city across differences of sexuality, origin, gender, and race, differences that make us stronger. Since his passing in November, much has been written about David Dinkins, but tonight we gather to hear directly from some of those who work closely with him at City Hall. Mayor Dinkins didn't just embody and advance historic progress. He surrounded himself with one of the most diverse administrations in city history. And some of its most distinguished members are on hand this evening to remember and reminisce. I could not be more pleased to welcome these Dinkins administration alumni to our Roosevelt House program tonight. First, a special welcome back to our virtual stage to Dr. Margaret Peggy Hamburg, who only a few weeks ago led a Roosevelt House discussion on public health. In addition to her service as Commissioner of Public Health and Mental Health in the New York City administration under Dinkins, she continued her remarkable career as Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration under President Obama, and as an assistant secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration. Thank you, Peggy, for coming back to be with us tonight. We also welcome Sally Hernandez Pinero, whose work with David Dinkins goes all the way back to his time as Manhattan Borough President when she served as his deputy. At City Hall, Sally was Deputy Mayor for Finance and Economic Development and then became chair of New York City's Housing Authority. Today, she serves on the board of New York City's Health and Hospitals Administration, and she is the chair of the MetroPlus Health Plan. Sally, it's so nice to have you with us tonight at Roosevelt House. We welcome also Richard Schrader, a veteran political strategist who worked with Mayor Dinkins as Commissioner of Consumer Affairs. In the years since, Richard has served as a leading voice on environmental protection, serving today as a policy director at the Natural Resource Defense Council. Thank you, Richard, for being with us. And a very special welcome to CUNY trustee Ken Sunshine, who does so much in that leadership capacity for Hunter College and the vibrant City University system. A true New York public relations legend whose client list reads like a who's who in show business, government, and worthy causes, Ken is the founder and president of Sunshine Sachs. Ken got his start in the political campaigns of legendary Hunter alum Bella Abzug, Hunter class of 1942, working alongside his friend of 46 years, Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer, whom we thank for producing this event tonight. Ken worked on both Dinkins' mayoral campaigns and served as his first chief of staff. Ken, thank you for being here tonight and all you do for Hunter and CUNY. To lead tonight's conversation, we are fortunate to have a trusted New York voice we like to call number one at New York One, none other than Errol Louis, who early in his career worked for Dinkins for mayor as a volunteer. As you know, Errol is now the trusted host of New York One's Inside City Hall. He is also a professor of CUNY's Craig Newmark School of Journalism, and we are proud he was a Jack Newfield Professor of Journalism right here at Hunter College. Recently, Errol produced and hosted a podcast series charting David Dinkins' journey from Borough Hall to City Hall, entitled The Making of a Mosaic. Errol, welcome back to Hunter, and thank you for bringing your personal experience and professional insights to this important program. And thank you for all you do to be a great voice in New York City. During another mayoral election season that coincides with ongoing crises of public health and economic need, along with a continuing racial reckoning across the country, there could be no more important time to explore the vital lessons of the mayoralty of David Norman Dinkins. So welcome and thank you to all our panelists, and welcome to all of you watching on Zoom. As a final note, before handing the program off to Errol, I want to acknowledge that today is the 87th birthday of the late and legendary Hunter alum, Audre Lorde, an iconic poet, activist, feminist, civil rights, and LGBT rights icon from the class of 1959. I end by quoting her with words she wrote to define herself, but could just as easily describe the courage and career of David Dinkins. Quote, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." With that, I could not be more pleased to turn this program over to Errol Louis. Thank you all for being with us.
And thank you, President Rob. As my panelists all unmute and put their cameras on, I'm very pleased and I welcome everybody to this great conversation. We're going to spend the next hour or so going through some of what is going to be, I hope, not just reminiscences about the Dinkins administration, although there is much to reminisce about, fond memories, conversations, but I want this to be more of a policy, a forward-looking policy conversation. There isn't a day that goes by when I don't think of the kind of wisdom and the kind of heart that went into the Dinkins administration and wonder how some of it could be better applied to some of the problems that we face today. There were health crises back then. There was certainly a crushing, crippling economic recession or economic downturn and very tough deficits. There was a crisis of political leadership. And yet and still, we not only got through it, but there were amazing projects like the tennis center in Flushing that got done at the same time. And I am thrilled to be with some of the people who made all of that happen and who remember it again, not just with the fond hindsight of memory, but with some lessons that I hope the current mayor and certainly the next one will be able to take to heart. So I thank all of the panelists in advance. And I wanted to ask each of them to think of something, a particular problem that we're facing today that you recall, that you feel like you've kind of seen before, that you'd maybe like to share with the current leadership and the next leadership of the city, that you'd like to be able to tell us in I guess, the voice of the Dinkins administration, the lessons of the past that can speak to the present and hopefully lead us into the future. And I've got to start with you, Dr. Hamburg. We had an AIDS crisis back then. We had a TB crisis that many people today don't remember or much talk about. You were the health commissioner. You were right in the middle of it. There were very contentious questions that were being raised, and there was a very high death count. It was as bad as anything I can remember up until this pandemic. What are the lessons from the early 1990s that we need to remember that might help us see our way through today's crisis?
Well, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here and to honor the legacy of a truly great man who certainly shaped my career in public service through his leadership and frankly through his confidence in me. You know, some of the things that I thought were remarkable about him that matter today and looking forward in terms of leadership for a city like New York, but also for our nation, is that number one, he cared about people, and that led him to be very supportive of public health. He understood that it was about keeping people healthy and keeping communities healthy, and that particularly in underserved parts of the city, robust public health measures would really make a difference. He also, as a leader, listened to the people that he'd selected to be in critical roles like health commissioner and supported us in doing what needed to be done. And a great example was in addressing the HIV pandemic and the accompanying TB crisis that the city faced. We should never forget that HIV, was a major infectious disease epidemic at the time and continues to burden communities in New York City, across the country and around the world. And it was actually being exacerbated also by the emergence of, or the resurgence of tuberculosis, but in a more dangerous form that was drug resistant. And that was very devastating to the HIV community who were immune compromised and more vulnerable, but also to everyone in the city. When I went to him to show him what we had learned about the magnitude of the TB problem that was threatening the city, he said to me, "What do we need to do?" And I, with the help of many experts around the city, developed a plan. He pulled together all of the people across the city that needed to be part of our response to TB and its control. And he anointed me the TB czarina. He basically empowered me to work with these different constituents to advance what needed to be done. He gave me control over the entire tuberculosis budget so we could make sure that critical parts of the program didn't fall through the cracks, like in the criminal justice system or in the housing system. And we were able to do what nobody thought we could do, which was to turn the tide on tuberculosis and drug-resistant tuberculosis, the hardest to treat. In just a couple of years, we became a model for the country and the world in terms of the different programs that we had. And it could never have happened if he hadn't recognized that this was a serious problem, if he hadn't deeply cared, and if he hadn't given the experts the authority to do what needed to be done and the support to do so. So, that's just one example that I think, really reminds us of what needs to be done. And frankly, it also underscores some of the gaps that we saw in our response to COVID-19.
I saw a photo. I'd love to show it to the audience of you vaccinating the mayor. Look at that.
That's right. I looked
In
a
the
little
blue room.
different back in those days, and I think that he didn't look completely happy, but he was very much someone who led by example. And it was very important for the city's vaccination efforts that he said, look, as we mounted our annual flu vaccine campaign, I'm taking the flu vaccine and I want all of you to take the flu vaccine. And that's the kind of leadership, again, we need now as we're addressing the COVID crisis and as we're concerned that there are many people and communities that are hesitant. They suspect that the vaccine may be dangerous. They don't trust government and authorities. They worry it was developed too quickly. And so we need our leaders to, talk the talk and walk the walk. And Mayor Dinkins always did that.
It's interesting. We have a governor and a mayor who have made a point of saying, I'm going to wait my place in line. The governor has said in Abyssinian Church, I'm not going to get mine until, Black and brown people who have been discriminated against get their shot. The mayor has said that he'll wait for his turn to come up. And I, not with the governor, but certainly with the mayor who I get to interview, I kind of suggested to him, I think maybe you should probably rethink that, that the people who are hesitant want to see you get the shot first. And that might be the better way to go. Was that a question with David Dinkins?
He wanted to do it. He thought it was an important event. He wanted to have a flu shot also. What he didn't completely understand was that was the only medical procedure I did each year, so that, he probably would have been in better hands with a different physician. But again, it came back to trust as well. He trusted me and that mattered.
When it comes to AIDS, when I was preparing my podcast documentary, I was shocked, even having lived through it, to sort of recall the high number of fatalities from AIDS, HIV/AIDS, that we were at the, in hindsight, so many years go by and you want to think of 1990 as sort of a midpoint, but it really wasn't. We were really kind of at the dawn of understanding of the crisis, its transmissibility. It was kind of clear that we needed to close down the sex clubs and that condoms were important and so forth. But where were you as far as, I guess, in the middle of that storm, trying to sort of figure out where the research was and what steps could be taken? And again, what can we learn from that experience?
Yeah, well, it was a very challenging time, and we were dealing with a disease that was expanding rapidly, taking lives in a devastating way. And we had very little to offer in terms of, effective drugs and treatments. That has changed. But at the time, it was a big medical challenge to take care of patients. But it was also creating all these ripple effects in terms of social, legal, ethical, economic, and political questions. And, circling back to the qualities of David Dinkins as a leader during that critical time, there's one other story that I'll tell. I didn't want to talk too much, but just quickly, he was against needle exchange, and a lot of the African-American community was against needle exchange too, because they saw giving out needles as a way of actually enabling serious problems of addiction that existed. And but we knew that contaminated needles was an important mechanism for HIV transmission. And he'd campaigned against needle exchange, and one of his early acts was shutting down a very small needle exchange program that the health department had. But one day on the front page of the New York Times, there was a story about a study done at Yale University that was the first quantitative demonstration that needle exchange programs could reduce HIV transmission. And he actually proactively, after reading that story, picked up the phone and called me. And he said, I want you to learn more about this study. And, if you think it's true, then I need to rethink my position about needle exchange. And so, we delved, a little group of us, both looked at that study and talked to the researchers and looked at the whole body of literature and went back to him and said, that yes, needle exchange done properly can reduce HIV transmission. And also, if it's done in a comprehensive way, there are other benefits. You can link people into necessary health care, addiction services, other social services they might need. And he said, okay, I will allow needle exchange programs to go forward despite my initial negative feelings about needle exchange. They have to be comprehensive because I don't want to just be handing out needles. I want to have a program that supports the needs and the health of individuals. But at the press conference, I'll never forget, he said, I will relax my opposition. And that was good enough.
Right.
And,
Right. In the end, he was a political leader, and doing a 180 is not that easy.
Yeah. But again, what have we seen in this last year? We've seen a terrible disconnect that can happen between science and evidence and good policy making. And, I think he deserves a lot of kudos for what he did.
Sally Hernandez Pinheiro, there is now, and there was then, an economic crisis running side by side with the health crisis. The exact start date of the recession that you had to govern through, I believe, was right around 89, 1990. I think it peaked probably 2/3 of the way through the administration. But there were deficits. There was a downturn. There wasn't help coming necessarily from Washington. What did you do then that we can learn from now?
I think a new mayor could learn two things. First, we had each agency create an agency reduction program, an expense reduction program, where they would take budget cuts in order to balance the budget. Because the mayor made clear that come what may, he was not going to fail to balance the budget. We're not going back to the control board. Everybody's got to come forth with ideas. Then he sat down for literally hundreds of hours in the basement of City Hall, going agency by agency, every single cut. Yes, teachers, no firefighters, hour after hour. And in so doing that, he was leaving his imprimatur on what his legacy ultimately would be. Because he did say homelessness, that is a priority. And he was able to ensure that we had the funds necessary to enact his homeless agenda. And the same thing with primary healthcare centers, children, healthcare, those homelessness, those were his primary core issues. So one, I would say that any mayor should be an extremely hands-on mayor and not to look at financial figures as just numbers, but to understand they're echoing a decision in every reduction that you take. Number two, and sort of correlated, is that they should have some clear priorities. They're not going to make a major impact in every single area. And if you really want to set a tone in 2 or 3 critical areas, one, you need to do what Dinkins always did, the mayor always did. He hired the best people and he trusted them, just what Dr. Hamburg said. And in setting his priorities, every time we came through another budget cycle, every time an economic decision came through that had to be thought about, he was clear on what his priorities were going to be. And I would recommend the same for an incoming mayor.
It's interesting. You probably, during those hours in the basement, saw something about him that I was always fascinated by. And it was really only after the mayoralty was over that I realized in talking with him that he had been a math major.
Absolutely.
And that those numbers that he played with, he could make them dance in his head. He did not like sloppiness. He did not like vagueness. Reporters who asked him and sort of fudged a number, he would, you would quickly realize that he was very much on top of the details.
Absolutely. And he also sat through those sessions with my 2-year-old son on his lap because he had to have a child.
Well, I mean, but that in some ways is an important lesson. Like he kind of understood that if he was going to trim a budget, that it was going to affect the rest of the budget, but that it was also going to affect the kids, the library hours, the opportunities, the sort of larger moral agenda that he was trying to enact.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when it came to trying to negotiate with the governor, Mario Cuomo, when it came to trying to negotiate with the feds, what was that like? I mean, we now have a situation where, we currently have a mayor who will often end his explanation of why he can't deliver things that he had promised by saying, we're not going to get any help from Washington, or, the state has gone in a different direction. You have those same problems too, right?
I think that I'll take a quick minute to say my own advocacy of a priority for this new mayor, and I'm probably just echoing Peggy on this, is absolutely healthcare. I think that's the issue that is going to make or break New York over the next 4 years. And I'm about to talk about that later, but dealing with the governor is like dealing with every governor. It's a heads-on battle at all times. And I think with core issues like financial responsibility and knowing that we want to maintain a certain level of independence, I think the mayor had quite a struggle with the former governor. Ultimately, there were issues of consensus, but it was quite a struggle. On a federal level, I think we're blessed because we have we have a new administration. We have someone who's sensitive to the issues of New York. We have Congressman Schumer, Senator Schumer. So I think that we're on a better footing. I still think the next 4 years is going to be financially extremely difficult. And I don't know how you prepare to be mayor. I can't say that Mayor Jenkins it was not his lifelong dream to become mayor. I don't know how you prepare to become mayor, but definitely having an understanding of how critical finances are and understanding of the city's budget is a core component of that.
It's interesting. I've often, as I do mayoral forums and I do a lot of interviews and so forth, people ask, well, who's got the experience to be the mayor? And you try to make clear to people, it's like, nobody's got 300,000 employees, nobody's got a 35,000, member police force that they've managed, or if they have, they're not running, so, and that's true every cycle.
Yes.
So, it gets to be harder to sort of figure out who is or isn't prepared. Rich Schrader, even in the economic distress of the early 1990s, that Forest Hills deal got done, that tennis center. The rezoning of Times Square at the last minute got done. What was it like to try and, I guess, even in a moment of unquestionable scarcity, try to figure out an economic future for the city? I mean, what was it that enabled that to be part of a serious part of the agenda, even as the budget was being slashed?
No, that's great, Errol. By the way, good to see you. 3 points. One is Mayor Dinkins, of course, an ex-Marine, was tough and full of resolve. And I don't know that history has been done enough service for him on that regard, as well as being a mathematician. He made a point early on, he was going to go out to Queens, talk to all of those who are going to be impacted by this. Some of those trips, I went out with him on them. There was concerns about habitat. There was concerns about the size of the arena altogether, the size of the overall project. There were obviously economic concerns. Carl Weisbrot did a tremendous job as the head of the Economic Development Corporation, but the mayor was very engaged, very hands-on. And that fall of '92, we had to get a bill passed through the Committee on Land Use. Chairwoman June Iceland from the Bronx was the chair of it. I would say one of the lessons, of course, for any mayor is to have a relationship that's meaningful and that's mutually supportive with the city council. especially the city council leadership. And Peter Vallone was an extraordinary partner for Mayor Dinkins, and Dinkins went out of his way to create that relationship. You know, it wasn't just they were there shaking hands trying to figure out how to cut a deal. They had a very warm relationship, but it didn't end there. You know, the mayor would get on the phone, or sometimes he'd go out on the rotunda at City Hall and grab some of the council members that he needed. And I was there, I saw it. We got through a very tough committee vote on Forest Hills, on Flushing. And it was everything you want. It was the 99-year lease. It's one of the biggest economic drivers in the city. Mayor Bloomberg said it's maybe the only really successful stadium deal that was ever made. And by the way, those courts are free for people and residents who are there. And Errol, while we're on it, and while we're on Peter Vallone, another example which I was very much engaged with was the successful effort to lobby for the Tobacco Regulation Act, which outlawed sales of cigarettes to kids under 18. And that was a brutal firefight. I mean, the tobacco industry and merchants threw everything they had at us. We're all still battle scarred from it. And Mayor Dinkins in 2019, right, still feisty in his 10th decade, excoriated his old adversary, the tobacco industry. And he said, you know, you're still trying to target kids to smoke, especially Black and brown kids. And we did a sting operation, he was very engaged in, by the way, with a bunch of 13-year-old kids who had Mets caps and a hidden camera on the cap. And they went in to buy tobacco products and cigarettes. And I had an inspector from Consumer Affairs follow them in. After this, 85%, by the way, the stores sold it to the kids without asking for a photo ID. Afterwards, Dinkins had the kids come to City Hall. And of course, that's his natural constituency.
Right.
And he walked in there and says, what, are you all Mets fans? I go, no, no, no. He goes, who do you root for? The Yankees. And he pointed at me, he said, blame him for those caps, not me, not me. And they asked where the camera was, and they pointed to the camera. And he said to the kids, what college are you going to go to? And he said, notice I didn't say, are you going to college? I said, what college are you going to go to? And, you know, I say now, think about this without shuddering. In that same situation of was Mayor Koch, Giuliani, or even Bloomberg, you know, they wouldn't be at the height of
Well, no, it's interesting. I mean, and we should keep in mind, I mean, you know, Philip Morris was like, you know, headquartered on 42nd Street, right? I mean, this was a pitched national battle. It wasn't just like a quiet little sting operation, right?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, my immediate predecessor, Mark Green, as commissioner, he and Dinkins, the mayor had really led the charge against getting the Joe Camel signs off of the city billboards. Joe Camel was a logo for tobacco industry, better known by 12-year-olds than Mickey Mouse at that point. And then the mayor enlisted his team, and I was included in this at Consumer Affairs when I became commissioner, not only get that bill done, but also to ban vending machines with cigarettes in it. And it was a huge battle. It was a national fight. Bill Clinton was doing this at a national level. But Mayor Dinkins, in I think one of the great urban movements and campaigns in city's history, not just New York City, was a tremendous leader on that, and very diligent and very tough. You know, he said at one point, he goes, I saw him a few years back. He says, you know, you get a certain age, you don't give a damn who's against you. Who disagrees with you. And he stuck to that. He was going after Philip Morris and RJ Reynolds in 2019 as much as he was in 1993.
Well, in fact, I want the whole panel to reflect on that. I'm going to talk to Ken for a minute, but I also wanted to have a conversation with all of you about a mayor who was not afraid to pick fights and to disappoint some of his allies, to let them know, hey, what I promised you is not what I'm going to do. Things have changed. I've changed. The situation has changed. But before we do that, Ken Sunshine, I want to touch on something that all of us remember, and it was in some ways the toughest part of the legacy, which was race relations, especially in the context of the relationship with the police and public safety. We all know that, as Mayor Dinkins used to say, people act as if everything was fine and crime began on January 1st, 1990. We all know that that wasn't true. On the other hand, once you're the mayor, it's your responsibility, right? So he's got this issue. He's the first Black mayor. He'd made promises in the direction of both keeping the city safe and also dealing with some police excesses that his predecessor had bequeathed to him. what was it like trying to, I guess, manage that conversation? What can we learn from there that would apply now, where we have some similar conversations and disputes going on now?
You know, one of the things I was thinking of when you were asking about similarities between 30 years ago and now is nothing changes. You know, the race issue was raw back then. We elected with extraordinary difficulty in putting a coalition together to elect the first Black mayor. And we had to get, it was 30% of the white vote. It was, you know, Bill Lynch, who, you know, ran the campaign. My buddy had brilliantly laid out exactly what we need to do in the ethnic tribal world of New York politics, particularly in those days. And it worked. And people forget in the primary, first time Dinkins won against three very accomplished opponents without a runoff. The runoff was 40% then, and he beat the incumbent mayor, Ed Koch, the controller Jay Golden, and businessman extraordinaire Dick Ravitch without a runoff. We had some trouble in the general election against this guy named Giuliani, but we did win. And what happened is there were unrealistic expectations, particularly in the African-American community, which had felt starved for attention, for resources. And there were expectations were very high that finally we get ours and we're going to be paid attention to. And the economic deprivation that enveloped many of the communities, particularly in areas of Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, were going to be taken care of. We had Sally was sitting in rooms where we were deciding how much to cut, let alone add. And the national economic situation was terrible. It got better later, frankly, when Clinton became president and later, and Giuliani benefited by that enormously. The economy got better nationally and urban America got better. But when we got there, it was tough sledding. So you had a situation where there was a great divide racially in the vote and in the communities. And you know, things happen all the time, no matter who's the mayor, by somebody who's, you know, people like me, like Dinkins, or somebody like Rudy, who appeals to maybe a different segment of the population. And the PBA and the cops were revving it up. You know, it was raw back then. And it's pretty raw right now. And we went through last summer with Black Lives Matter and reaction, police issues. What goes around comes around. Two things about Dinkins, Rich touched on it, that people, and I think frankly his legacy, other than the terrible New York Times obit, there was wonderful things written and said about him when he passed, in memory of him. But two qualities that people ask, what was he like? Because I stayed very close to him personally, right? Talked to him a couple of days before he passed. He was a lot smarter than people thought, and he was a lot tougher than people thought. People, you know, the image, because he wore a black tie and he went out a lot, and he was such a genteel, wonderful person compared to Koch and Giuliani, to be frank. You know, he buttressed them, that people thought that, you know, oh, he's just sort of a benign figurehead. He was no figurehead. And talk to anybody that sat with him in budget negotiations or when he had to make tough decisions politically. I'll talk to one that I love talking about, and it touches a little bit on the AIDS crisis in an obvious way. The decision, I remember the decision to whether he should march in the St. Patrick's Day parade. The first one, because the gay floats were banned, and there were raw issues between the segments of the LBGT, it weren't called that then, the gay community and the activist community led by ACT UP and the Archdiocese. And there were some pretty ugly incidents were happening at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and, you know, and Cardinal O'Connor, who certainly was unsympathetic on certain issues, but on issues of race and class and labor was pretty good. I got to know him fairly well, and you know, I wasn't going to argue with him about choice or gay rights, but it was complicated. And Dinkins developed a very close relationship with him, as a mayor should. Well, it was a big deal to say no to the St. Patrick's Day parade, and he took a lot of heat on that. And to be frank, in the African-American community, the issue of gay rights was not very popular then. It wasn't very popular citywide. It changed. But people like David Dinkins and Bill Lynch, they didn't deviate for a second about not marching in that parade. And that was a big international story. And I've never been so impressed by two tough cookies standing up for principle, and they did not march.
Ken, was there anybody in the inner circle who would kind of push in the other direction and say, listen, this is killing us. We need to get some other stuff done. We need to pass a budget. We need some friends in some corner of the city. Maybe we should let this one go. Did that ever come up as a consideration?
I think Bill would have killed them if they had brought it up. It was.
Well, I think Norm Steisel was the voice that tended to sound more on that corner. And Ken, I wanted to mention to you, you said the Black community had unrealistic expectations. I think the white community had unrealistic expectations.
Absolutely.
I thought he was going to come, keep the people calm, get them back out in the fields or something. And he just blew them away. And
Yeah.
it was, I think they saw him as genteel and proper and old school and thought that somehow was going to transmit over to the entire community. And I think he never wanted to be a Black mayor. I think he always got to be a Black mayor.
Yeah, especially when those racially charged incidents happened that unfortunately defined some of his legacy, the Korean boycott and, the Crown Heights incident. And, but the fundamental decency and smarts of this guy is really what the legacy should be, besides the pioneering nature of his victory. To quote Reverend Al Sharpton, who nobody better, there would be no Barack Obama if not for David Dinkins being elected mayor. And that is really true.
What does he mean by that?
He means that it took the victories where white people would vote for somebody Black to set the stage for the first Black president. You would talk to any of us back then, 1989, 90, there's going to be a Black president. I would have, oh yeah, I hope, but no way. You could look how hard it was to get the first Black mayor of New York. This is New York. And we prayed to get 30% of the Black vote for David Dinkins. It took those victories and other mayors in other cities and a couple of governors and others that slowly changed, the attitude toward race when it comes to electing the people to high office.
And Errol, if I could just say, I think we've seen, though, in the broad stroke, an absolute undermining of David Dinkins and his tremendous, tremendous legacy. And it's partly, as Kenny said, his great victory to begin with, and what all of us have been saying, his successes, the AIDS and tobacco, the tennis, but also the way he dealt with the budget, as Sally mentioned. It was extraordinarily difficult and grace under pressure of the utmost, more than I've seen any elected official. I've dealt with so many elected officials in my day. This is a guy that had a steely kind of toughness and coolness to him. But partly, I think, he was dismissed by a certain type of elite class. Partly, absolutely, it's racial, and Giuliani should take a lot of the blame for that. Giuliani ran a permanent campaign against him. He never stopped. He went at him every chance he could. He had Roger Ailes behind him, who, by the way, ran his campaign in '89. And a guy named Donald Trump was a big, big donor to Giuliani all through the 4 years. And then, you had Ed Koch, who in many ways was a decent mayor himself, but because of his own ego and because of his own sense of who he was, maybe an exalted sense, he turned on Dinkins and supported Giuliani, which of course he regretted for the rest of his life that he'd done that. But Giuliani has to be seen as already a kind of dark, destructive force. He tried to kill the tennis deal. If you guys remember this, he tried to come in there and say, you shouldn't sign the contract on it. After Dinkins been working this for 3 years.
He never went there as mayor.
He never went there. He never went there. He would always brag going to Yankee Stadium as if this is some sign of, some great populism, this guy from Garden City.
And when you explain it to people, every time I have to explain it to people, I just marvel again, right? That we're getting a percentage of the gross revenue. We're like partners in every ticket that's sold. And when I went out there, we did a few years ago, I went out there when they were naming some piece of the complex for the mayor.
Mhm.
And I put on my seersucker suit and put on my bow tie and tried to, kind of match him a little bit. And there was so much, they just adored him. The players and the security staff and the food servers and everybody. But I was shocked. I'd never been out there. There was so much economic activity, and knowing how the deal was structured, I was thinking, like, this is just unbelievable. This is just unbelievable. I mean, we'll never get a concession like that for anything in this city, from a pretzel cart to a football stadium. It's just unheard of.
I
So
think I think it was tied in with this. It started with the sense of, here's a Black man playing tennis. It was connected to a real sense of elitism about him. And somehow many people couldn't get past that to seeing the USTA as a real economic engine. I think it was still linked as if it was an offshoot of his preference for a particular sport. Same thing with the air path that had to be cleared for a period of time. It kept coming back as if it was his personal proclivity as opposed to an economic development project.
In a few minutes, I want to remind our audience that's watching, you should use the button at the center of your screen, the bottom center of your screen, to add any questions that you'd like, and we'll add you to the conversation in just a few minutes. Dr. Hamburg, when you were health commissioner and you had to deal with some of these changes in policy, some of these life and death issues, where people thought the mayor was maybe going in the wrong direction or doing something that he had not promised or doing the opposite of what he had promised, what would you tell them? And I don't mean sort of public statements. I mean just you in living rooms, talking with friends and so forth. Was there a sense that this is what leadership means? Or was there a sense that you almost had to, apologize for the fact that the mayor was going in a different direction? What was how did you convey to people what it was like to be in that administration and make these kind of hard choices?
Well, there weren't that many times where I really felt like, oh my God, Mayor Dinkins is making a really bad choice here. I felt, on the contrary, that he really did listen to advice. He looked at evidence, and he made hard decisions, but generally in the way that I hoped for. We talked about the budget crisis, for example. When I first came on, I was actually acting commissioner. I didn't have any expectation that I'd be the commissioner, because you actually had to have a master's of public health, which I did not. The city charter required that. But the prior health commissioner left very abruptly, and I was asked to stand in as acting. And I inherited from that other health commissioner a budget that was unimplementable in the context of the mayor's request for budget cuts. I mean, the outgoing commissioner wanted to leave in good graces, I think, and he had put a lot of stuff on the table that really would have been devastating. I mean, basically, practically eliminating the entire immunization program for the city, cutting back on all the TB clinics, just as we were having a resurgence of TB, many other things. And I went to him, and I remember sitting with him and the corporation counsel, Victor Kovner, and going through why the health department couldn't meet its budget targets that had been put forward, why these cuts, would be, really impossible to implement, devastating to health, and really undermine the overall health and economic prosperity of the city over the longer term. And, he listened very carefully. I thought, fat chance I'll actually penetrate. And on the spot, he gave me back a chunk of money. And then he said, let's work through all of the other items. On the tobacco issue, similarly, I saw him, take some courageous positions, knowing that important resources for the city in terms of all the cultural sports and cultural activities that Philip Morris was funding, that he might take a big hit, but doing what was right. So I really was very struck by that. It was my first real experience working directly in that kind of a health leadership role. And so, he set a standard that wasn't always met subsequently. And I was actually one of the rare individuals in the Dinkins administration who stayed on into the Giuliani administration. It was quite a learning experience. It was different in many ways. And Mayor Giuliani did not want me to give him his flu shot.
Yeah, he probably thought he was mean enough to just beat the flu or something. Well, let me ask you this though, Dr. Hamburg. The CDC's guidance on how to deal with the pandemic, which I did read through at the start of the pandemic last year, it actually has some pretty detailed stuff about how to communicate with the public. And it sounds like what you did in the Dinkins administration was closer to what the CDC recommends, which is turn over responsibility to the public health leadership, let them be the public face of it, and come in to back them up, but otherwise don't necessarily grab the podium every day, which neither our current mayor nor governor seems to have taken to heart at all. Would that be a fair statement?
No, that was very, very true. And I think, it was important. And we had, a number of crises where I think that by enabling the health department or the right experts within the health department or the city, take the lead on talking to the public, it did make a difference. I think he also did appreciate the fact that you needed to engage with groups that were important to people and not always do everything through government channels as well. Mm-hmm. And to make sure that you had the right message and the right messengers, and he was very sensitive to that as well.
Okay, let's Mac Barrett is going to help us go through some of the questions that have been accumulating, and it looks like we have quite a few.
That's right. Thanks, Errol, and thanks everybody. This has been great. There are lots of questions. I'll share as many with you as time allows. The first from a chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission under Dinkins, Lori Beckelman. She says one area where maybe we ought to amplify the mayor's accomplishments is in landmarks, and she cites the example of the African burial ground, which wasn't necessarily easy for him to support. Does anybody care to comment on the mayor as a leader for landmarks for the city?
I remember when that happened. I didn't think of it as a Dinkins era thing. I'm getting old. This was like right next to the federal courthouse, right? And the information came up that it had been an African burial ground, and I guess it would. I thought it was a federal landmark, but there was city involvement.
Apparently. Okay.
My area.
Moving on. Vincent McGee says, what about Dinkins and his global view, such as going to South Africa to show support for Mandela and the end of apartheid?
Wow.
Well, I'll jump in on that because I remember that trip, and Vinny McGee was part of it. And I was reflecting on it during some of our earlier discussion, because the mayor, I'm not quite sure how he had a relationship with Mandela, but he did. And when Mandela came out of prison and was going to become president, he took a group of individuals over to help advise and provide some technical assistance and capacity building in some key areas. And I headed up the health delegation because HIV and TB were big issues in South Africa then, and he got a lot of flack for that. He was really criticized that this was, just something that he wanted to do on a personal level, and he was, gallivanting over there when there were problems in the city that needed to be handled, and why would he do this? But he was a global citizen, and I think he also recognized that New York City had experience that would be very, very meaningful to convey as this new administration in South Africa at a critical and very challenging time
But more than that, I think in terms of a public persona, and that was, Frank, I think it was a big deal and it answers his question. But when Nelson Mandela got out of prison and Dinkins as mayor in New York hosted the first of several US visits for President Mandela, which is one of the highlights. I've done some pretty cool things over the years. Having been a part of that, helping to plan that is right at the top of them. And the ticker tape parade, going to Boys and Girls High School, the Yankee Stadium concert, he and Winnie Mandela staying at Gracie Mansion. It was truly one of the extraordinary things about the Dinkins years, but really in the history of New York, and the claim that the Mandela got. And look what Mandela did then. He became president, and the Reconciliation Commission and the legacy of Mandela is, I think, unequaled among any leader I could name over the last hundreds of years. And David Dinkins, that got a lot of attention, obviously, but Dinkins' role in it deserves more attention because he really planned the whole thing. And I think any of us that had anything to do with it will never forget.
And it's one of his most eloquent speeches, the introduction to Mandela. Listen, Dinkins also had a real global vision. As the person who asked the question said, he talked a lot about Africa. He understood it in a very complicated and sophisticated way. And he understood the idea of healing, as Ken said, the reconciliation structure and what that would look like. And I think that it's something that's, of course, also been forgotten. The Dinkins had a kind of a global understanding of how, race and class, and also just how the world is interactive. And one's all connected to the other. He used to say that a lot. He said it, of course, the night that he conceded. That's a speech that no one will forget. He was there at the time. But he said that many other times. I'd hear him say it one-on-one to council members. Be something that's part of something bigger than you.
A lot of that, of course, came full circle. And one of the great moments for me in recent years was to go down to Washington, down to the White House, to see Patrick Gaspard, one of the kids who worked for Ken Sunshine, being sworn in as the ambassador to South Africa, sworn in by Joe Biden, with David Dinkins holding the Bible. It was, these seeds did come to fruition. This wasn't just talk about empowerment or inspiring a generation. It actually happened. It actually happened.
And also, and part of the legacy are all the kids like this guy de Blasio, like this guy Gaspard, and many, many others who at their most formative years in getting into public life were trained by David Dinkins and Bill Lynch, and look what happened to them. Gaspard is maybe the superstar of the group, but lots and lots of others, and just people he touched that are leaders in many industries, and particularly in government and public service.
I mean, I have to jump in and say, Dinkins took a huge chance on me. I had not run a big, complicated public health agency. I was a few years out from my medical training. I'd worked at the National Institutes of Health doing infectious disease research and policy, and I was working closely with Tony Fauci, who was a good mentor. But I had this period as acting commissioner, and he saw my work, and he was comfortable with how I was leading, and he just said, I want you to be my commissioner. He went to city council and got them to change the charter so that I actually could be, and that was somewhat controversial, and he supported me throughout my career after that. He really did. He took great pride. And he made a huge difference. He opened that door that allowed me to go forward and do a lot of other things.
I have to echo that. I never knew him before. I'd never been in government or politics before. And he took me based on the recommendation of one of his infamous committees. Having been interviewed, and once I was hired, gave me the opportunity to show that I could do good work for him. And when he appointed me deputy mayor, I was not popular among business industry leaders, but he supported me in every instance. So I'm very grateful for him.
My little piece of it is I obviously was very involved politically and helped run the campaign, and he won. And I wanted to start my firm. I didn't want to go into government. I knew enough about government and me that it wasn't for me. And I was summoned to a breakfast with Percy Sutton and Basil Patterson, who were somewhat mentors of mine I was close to. And in about 5 minutes, they basically told me I was going into the government, that I could go, but the negotiation, Patterson became my lawyer, that I would go in for 1 year, which I did, as long as I pledged to, and I could start my firm and do what I want, as long as I could help out, as long as I would help run his reelection campaign, which I did. But he took, look, I came from an unconventional background to that role, and it was topsy-turvy and crazy. All the cool things I've done over many years, though that year in government, I still tell the stories. I can't quite remember, but it's a great influence on all of us.
And my story is simply, he couldn't have been a more loyal boss, a more loyal mayor. You know, they were lining up in a queue to get me fired, you know, from the tobacco industry to the debt collection agencies to some of the nightclub owners, you know, letters were piling up. And I'll say Deputy Mayors Steisel and Lynch were also extremely important in this, but Mayor Dinkins stayed with me. I mean, when we went after predatory lenders, it was one of the first times in the country that a city went after these lenders who were doing it. And it was vicious and unbelievably vile stuff happening in low-income communities. But they were powerful. Some of it went right up to some of the too big to fail banks. And they wanted me gone, you know, but the mayor stuck to it and understood, because he had a great moral fiber. I mean, this is a guy with, we haven't said that yet. The moral character of Dinkins is so different than what we see in most elected officials, beyond any comparison. I would say for people I've dealt with in the world of nonprofits, dealt with in private sector, this is a guy of great moral fiber and character. And, you know, he'd stick with you when you felt you were doing the right thing.
We have some clarification from none other than Gail Brewer on the matter of the African burial ground. I'll just share that with you quickly and then move on to another question. She says that as the director of the federal office, she received a call that the African burial ground was under the court building. The building was paid for by funds arranged by Senator Moynihan. He was upset that his building would be slowed down by the burial ground, and the Deputy Mayor Barbara Fife was assigned to the senator to deal with him. And there were many steps before they were able to resolve it. I'm obliged to share anything that Gail writes in, but
that's a good story. Wow.
Great.
I never knew that.
Good to hear from you, Gail.
Yes. And so a question here from Linda Hamilton, who says she worked with the mayor for the last 8 years or so of his life. She says, please also discuss how he authentically lit up around children and how they were always his guiding light for nearly every decision about the future of our city. So his efforts on behalf of child welfare.
Well, I would say on the issue of homelessness, the reason that was his #1 priority, not because it was a great voting population, but because half of the homeless were children. And he felt strongly that they were the greatest victims of this crisis, and that was going to be a priority for him.
Right.
And on a personal level, he
That was
loved
true with the Beacon schools too, right? The after-school programs. I mean, it was, you know, stuff was getting slashed to the bone. And, you know, they said the libraries are going to stay open and we're going to have after-school programs. And I was too old to benefit from any of that, but I thought it was extraordinary that when even people were being cut from, you know, frontline services, housing, you know, HPD, friends I had at HPD that were getting laid off. And they said, after school programs will stay come hell or high water.
Yeah. If you wanted to sell him a program, you always made sure you talked about the impact on kids.
And here's another important topic, much less lighthearted. Susan Souter asks that the panel address the Crown Heights issue. How should we look at the Crown Heights issue in retrospect, recognizing that this has been seen unfairly as a big part of his legacy?
I thought we'd go through one of these without getting into the Crown Heights. Look, I could talk about this for hours. but I'm going to talk about it for a few minutes. When you're on the front lines on tough incidents, you see it in government and politics all the time. You have to make choices and make decisions, and people are ready to jump at you at any moment. And in hindsight, should he have done things a little differently? Yeah, probably. And he said that. But to blame him and the avalanche of negativity, racially charged negativity, was so outrageously over the top and personal, and it really did hurt him. And the one thing about David Dinkins, he was a tough guy, but to accuse him of being racial and anti-Semitic, I mean, the guy, let me tell you, the guy went to more Jewish events and more synagogues than I ever dreamed of going, and knew more about he asked him to talk about the Holocaust, how many concentration camps he had gone to, how many times he'd gone to Israel, and knew what Israel meant to the Jewish people and meant to people over the world. I've never met anybody, black, white, or Jewish, who spoke as sensitively about that. And it pained him that the implication that he acted wrongly because of racial, maybe the most vicious thing, other than a certain police event on the steps of City Hall in the whole history in his 4 years.
I would agree with Ken. I don't think people understood that he was between a group of extreme Black agitators who were trying to turn the Black community against him, and a civic community that had a sense of entitlement and was not a particularly good neighbor. You had two extremely two groups that could not come to agreement. It would have been impossible. And the thing the mayor recognized, and Ken said this, is that perhaps he was waiting to hear from the police commissioner, and perhaps he could have acted a little sooner. But the groups he was dealing with were so intransigent that I don't think the public ever really understood that.
And the irony of what happened is, the doctor made a mistake in the ER of Kings County Hospital, and the kid bled to death. They missed the wound. The irony of what happened, the kid shouldn't have died.
Right.
I said it in terms of how unfair the reaction was, but you name a mayor or a governor that doesn't have impossible decisions to make, and you're going to piss somebody off no matter what you do. And that was a terrible incident. It obviously hurt greatly his reelection campaign, or hurt his reelection campaign. He didn't win, or came damn close, but it was really unfair.
Yeah, Sally and Ken, I agree completely with it. I mean, look at this in the context of why is this the one thing that seemed to be talked about over and over for so many years about the Dinkins administration. It's not about affordable housing. It's not about after-school programs or the tennis or tobacco or the 30 other great accomplishments of this mayoralty in 4 years. It's Crown Heights, which mistakes were made, is a terrible tragedy, no question about it. And a tragedy on so many different levels, as Kenny points out. There's also a whole malpractice piece. But why is it the only piece? Why is it the only sort of story that gets in the middle of this? In fact, it's basically about a third of the Times obit. Stunningly, it's what that obituary just started talking, starts on and won't let go. And until Michael Powell did a terrific other piece on it for the Times, and Tom Robbins' superb piece in the New Yorker, this was threateningly to be the way that the New York Times and the rest of us might, others might remember David Dinkins. There was so much more to it. It should never have been the one thing that people made a decision on whether to let him have another term or not.
I will say, as a resident of Crown Heights, where I'm sitting right now, who has worked with my neighbors in the Jewish community for decades to try and repair some of what happened there, it is to this day widely mischaracterized and misunderstood. And it very quickly reaches the point where I have to agree to disagree with my neighbors, where I say, listen, I was there. I live 5 blocks from where it happened. I remember it differently. I am convinced, just given the incredible run of bad choices and bad luck that all descended in one place, that if it wasn't one tragedy, it would have been another. There was just no way that wasn't going to be a complete disaster. You know, it's easy to say, oh, they should have turned the cops loose and let them go and crack heads and shut everything down the first 2 nights. Oh, you think so?
Mm.
We'd be talking about a different tragedy, you know, about the people who got shot or the people who got killed or the fires that were set or whatever else it would have been. It was a disaster. It was a disaster before it happened. It was a disaster after it happened. It would have been a disaster any which way. You know, it's like a hurricane making landfall. The hurricane force winds, maybe a car lands on you, maybe a tree falls over, maybe it's a flood that drowns you, but it's going to be a disaster. That's what that was to me.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see. How about just 1 or 2 more before we wrap up? Is that all right? All right. So Michael Galabter says that the mayor, sorry if I'm botching that name, that he and Lee Brown got the ball rolling on tremendous increases in safety. Safety increases the safety has improved since his tenure. Could you give us some color or insight on that?
Well,
Well,
it increased throughout his tenure, right? I mean,
5,000 police officers, right?
yeah. I mean, and I mean, crime came down like what, guys, after the second or third quarter of the first year?
Mhm.
Violent
It
crime.
kept going down.
Double digits for about 2.5 years. By the way, Michael Galopter, one of the great public servants too in the city. And hello, Michael. It's good to know you're
Here.
The bottom line in terms of the Dinkins, of course, the anti-crime campaign has also been completely in many ways unknown and not given enough credit. You know, Ray Kelly, for all the things happened later in a different administration, was a very, very strong police commissioner, and I worked with him on a bunch of different projects and investigations. And by the way, you know, community policing had a great and indelible kind of moment where the police were really becoming part of the community. This was something that Bill Bratton talked about in his memoirs and gave Dinkins a great deal of credit for. He didn't give Kelly credit, but he gave Dinkins credit for it. And he always spoke highly of Mayor Dinkins. But I would say that's something that there's a couple of books there to be written about the sort of unknown, almost secret history of the Dinkins growing success in fighting crime and also in doing it in a way that was even-handed with a sense of compassion to it as well. Giuliani had great success with Bratton. By the way, Bratton's reward was he got fired after 2 years because he was getting a little too well known for Mayor Giuliani. But the truth is they did have great success, but at some real cost, which saw itself, of course, even explode further with the stop and frisk.
I would maintain, and I think it's absolutely true, that remember the Dinkins had gotten beaten up pretty badly in the press. He almost won re-election. We came really close. If he had won, he would have had a stupendous second term. The crime was going down. The economy was getting better in all of America. You know, Clinton and, you know, the effects of a lot of fiscal policies, it made the economy better. He would have been able to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do, but frankly, Sally didn't have enough money for. And it's a real tragedy politically that he couldn't fulfill what he wanted to do. It would have happened in the second term. And I think the legacy, New York Times should be ashamed of themselves that dominated their version of his legacy. It would have been very different in the eyes of the so-called opinion makers, because he would have had many more things, tangible results that we could have talked about in this panel.
Yeah, as a final question, I'll just ask if anybody else wants to contribute on the subject of what cost him re-election, what went into his losing the re-election, and then we'll make that our last question and wrap up.
Yeah, I think two starts to that. One is clearly Crown Heights, and it was thrown at him over and over again. And again, part of a sort of permanent Giuliani campaign is a constant dissenting voice, including nearly starting a riot by the police on the steps of City Hall, but also the enormous kind of right-wing presence in the city in those days with the New York Post and Roger Ailes' great reach and importance, and the power of the right wing was extraordinary, especially with white ethnics then. Secondly, we forget this, but on a tactical basis, there was a referendum for Staten Island to secede. And that cost Dinkins how many votes and added what on to Giuliani? It was a very close election in '93. Dinkins was far, far from being knocked out. But that Staten Island secession thing, which by the way never happened as far as I can tell.
course not.
Not sure what the law. I'm not sure what the law is on this, but
It wasn't supposed to happen. It was
yeah.
there
So
for.
who put it
good
up
reason.
there? Who was responsible for that, and who was the the great tactical genius that figured that would get more Giuliani votes out?
Yeah, but also it was just the metrics. There was a slightly decreased Black turnout the second time, slightly increased turnout in certain white communities that were going to vote for Rudy. But it was almost the same election. The remarkable thing about the '89 and '93 elections, Dinkins versus Giuliani, is how close they were. Very, very, both very divided city, divided electorate. But you know, if they'd have gone differently, his legacy would have been quite different.
Anybody else on that? Well, I thank you all. I sincerely thank you all for this. This has been spectacular. This one meant a lot to me. I was taken in the middle of the night by my mother to woken up as a child to attend a Dinkins rally. And that was my first political event. And I had the fortune of meeting him a few times over the years. So are there any final thoughts before we finish?
Thank you for doing this.
Yes, thank you.
Great idea. Thank you, Mac.
Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.